you took yourself back to 1790, for example, you would not have known that Cincinnati would be the major city here. Could just as easily have been Newport.
Those were where the real foundation of organized crime in Newport began.
Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin and all these other nationally known figures would come in and do shows at.
You really cannot underestimate, even though it was illegal, how open gambling was.
The local fire marshal said it was almost certainly arson.
Newport, Kentucky is an urban city located right across the river from Cincinnati, Ohio. Today, the city is home to more than 13,000 people. But Newport has a past. Known as the first Las Vegas, the city thrived on gambling, clubs, and the presence of the mob from the 1930s through the 60s. In this age, the city expanded to host more than 100,000 people at night. We sat down with the Newport historian, a former journalist, an author, and a Northern Kentucky University history professor to explore Sin City's rich history.
You know, Newport is an interesting case because already from the early 1800s on, it was the site of the Newport Barracks, which was a U.S. Army military installation.
You have a group of men that are looking for diversions from Army life. And so it didn't take very long before houses of prostitution and illegal gambling were happening around the Newport Barracks.
So Newport had a very early history of being sort of wide open. When we get to the time period of prohibition, and that becomes effective in 1920, that literally is the time that the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages is prohibited, hence the name prohibition.
When prohibition came along, this group of organized criminals decided they could fulfill a huge demand for bootleg liquor.
There were factions that realized that Newport was in a wonderful position to actually start providing illegal alcohol.
One of the greatest of these, not only regionally but nationally, was George Remus, who was known as the king of the bootleggers. And he set up out of Cincinnati, but his distribution place was right in northern Kentucky.
He helped supply the mobs and some of the others with alcohol as well.
He had set it up so that he pretty much owned everybody. He had the police, sheriff, the judges, the prosecutors, politicians, the council members. Everybody was on the take with George Remus. And when he went to prison, his gangsters, who had been working with him, came back to Newport and started to set up casinos and nightclubs. And those were where the real foundation of organized crime in Newport began.
There was no shortage of rumors when it came to the presence of the mob in Newport. When Bronson began researching for his book, Forbidden Fruit, Sin City's Underworld and the Supper Club Inferno, he was shocked by what he found.
I was figured it was probably just a bunch of punks that thought they were mobbed up, that were kind of wannabe mafiosos that ran Newport. Not at all. The big mob that ran this territory was the Cleveland Four, and they were also known as the Silent Syndicate.
So what do you do when in 1933 prohibition is repealed and the flow of alcohol returns? How do you continue to make your money if you're a bootlegger? And many of the bootleggers just kind of segued themselves right into the gambling business.
Monmouth Street was the focal point of Sin City. In its heyday, there were more than 15 clubs and casinos lining the street. And there were two types of places where folks could gamble away their money: bust-out joints and carpet joints.
There were bust-out joints, which were the really tacky, rough places where they call them bust-out joints because you never were allowed to leave until you were busted out.
Carpet joints, they're nice meals, nice shows, entertainers, and of course you have gambling as well.
In these places, the odds were nicer, they were more fair, and not as heavily fixed for the house.
Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin and all these other nationally known figures would come in and do shows at. So you could go for a show, you could go for a nice dinner, and if you wanted to, then you could go to the back rooms and play either the slots, but more particularly something like poker or blackjack or one of the table games.
The nicest of the nice places that put Newport and Northern Kentucky on the map was Pete Schmidt's Beverly Hills Country Club. It was known as the show place of the nation. probably the most famous nightclub between the coasts.
As the mob continued to move in on Newport, they began buying up high-end venues, and the Beverly Hills Country Club was just the type of place they were looking for.
Mo Dallas was a purple gang mobster from Detroit, a very tough guy. He pretty much ran the Cleveland mob, and when he came down one time to see the Beverly Hills Country Club, he decided then and there this had to be his place.
You know, Peter Schmidt kind of established the Beverly Hills Supper Club in 1933. By 1937, the syndicate was saying, you know, we want it, we want it.
So Mo Dallas came down and he saw this club and he told Pete Schmidt, the owner, you have an ultimatum, which is I'll buy you out or I'll burn you out. And Pete, being a tough guy, decided he was going to tell Mo just to go back to Cleveland, mind your own beeswax. That's not how it turned out.
So there's a fire. This is the first fire at Beverly Hills.
And a little girl was 5 years old and was staying with her sister, who was the wife of the caretaker of that place, died in the fire. And she was the first casualty in northern Kentucky of the mob.
You really cannot underestimate during the heyday of Sin City how open, even though it was illegal, how open gambling was.
So Mustang Betty's, back in the day, that was one of these one-stop places. They had brothel upstairs, they had drinking and gambling on the first floor, and down below they had this incredible phony tangle of lines coming in from all over the country to take these layoff bets.
Another one is the Lookout House, which is bought up by a man named Jimmy Brink. And that's also right around 1933, and that sat outside Covington in a little city that becomes known as Lookout Heights.
It had a high enough topography that they could see the state police coming in from Frankfurt. And so a lot of these gambling establishments, by the time the state police got there, it was just a supper club operating, people having dinner. There wasn't any gambling going on.
Now, if you look at that, then you say, gee, how does this affect the economy? And it affects the economy so much. I mean, Newport is so prosperous. When conventioners come into Cincinnati, everybody knows Newport is the Sin City of the South. It's sometimes called Little Mexico.
Newport was viewed really not just here, not just Cincinnati, but in a way nationally as a playground where things that we would go to jail for somewhere else, you won't go to jail for here.
In many ways, it was good for the economy for the average people. And Newport had a much larger population at that time than it does now.
By day, Newport had a resident population of about 30,000 people. By night, they said it was 100,000 people in Newport, you know, literally at the clubs and gambling and doing everything else.
People were in the restaurants, they were buying food, and the mobsters would bring their girlfriends into the dress shops and they'd be buying high-end dresses in the dress shops. And so a lot of the citizens were enjoying kind of an economic benefit of it.
When the economy is, you know, really hinged on that sort of prosperity of illegal gambling, then people tend to wink, they tend to look the other way because their own prosperity is involved.
You often will hear that Northern Kentucky is a stepchild. Part of the reason for that is because Northern Kentucky did not want to be looked at closely by state law enforcement. You didn't want the state police to come in. Just leave us alone. We've got our gambling. It's part of our culture. We're not asking anything from Frankfurt. We just want to be left alone.
Quite frankly, when people say, oh, we're such a poor stepchild, we caused it. And what we did is we didn't want the state police or the state government intervening in our business.
If you do that for enough years, when you clean it all up and you don't want to be the stepchild anymore, you're kind of shut out. So you have to rebuild that connection to the state. The city officials in Newport, the citizens in Newport, want it to be a normal town. They didn't want to be Sin City, and they set about to make a change that would be significant.
Reform efforts had been ongoing in Newport for several years, but the mob had proved to be too powerful. The community needed a figurehead. They needed someone in law enforcement who wouldn't bow down to illegal activity. And so they chose Cincinnati native and All-American quarterback George Ratterman. But the mob wouldn't go down without a fight. And so the story continues with a smear campaign, arrest, trial, and the involvement of the Kennedys.
There was a battle constantly being waged by reformers who wanted to get rid of these mobs and their gambling and their hookers and their nightclubs and their bootleg booze and drugs. And then on the other side, liberals were known as the people who wanted Newport to stay dirty because that's where they got their money.
But it really became a community effort for cleanup, and it took quite a while to get that cleanup going.
It begins with a group called the Committee of 500. These were the strongest reformers, and their headquarters was right at the north end of Monmouth Street.
The Committee of 500 operated a lot in secrecy as far as who were members of that committee, because they were afraid of reprisals.
It's very well financed, and it's looking towards reform. And it said, we really need somebody who's a clean-cut Catholic who is popular to run for sheriff of Campbell County to kind of literally shut things down.
And who they found was a man named George Ratterman, a great athlete, a fantastic story, a fun-loving guy, great sense of humor. He was, by the way, one of the greatest quarterbacks at Notre Dame of all time. He played in the NFL. He became an NFL color analyst before that was really a thing.
He eventually got his degree from Salmon P. Chase Law School, which is now part of NKU.
And then he became an investment advisor in Cincinnati. He lived in Fort Thomas. So the Committee of 500 approached him and he agreed to run for sheriff. Well, the mob didn't like this at all because he was drawing rallies so big that they would have to close streets in northern Kentucky for his rallies. So they could see the writing on the wall and they had to do something.
So Tito Corinzi, who was from part of the syndicate from Steubenville, Ohio, also a football player, invites him, and he operates the Tropicana Club Glen Hotel. And he invites him to dinner and says, we want to work this out and not, necessarily be involved in all this anymore.
They were going to have a meeting to talk about how Tito wanted to leave the mob. It was all a fantasy. And by his own testimony in court, George Ratterman had something like 11 scotch and sodas that night. And somewhere along number 9 and 10, they gave him some knockout drops. They took him across the river to the Tropicana upstairs. That was Tito Corinzi's nightclub, and put him in bed with a stripper whose stage name was April Flowers. Her real name was Juanita Hodges.
They call the police, and he's caught in, being drugged in an uncompromising position with a prostitute.
Ratterman was arrested on May 9th, 1961, and charged with soliciting prostitution.
It looked like the end of his campaign. Well, what happened was he had a blood test and it showed there's massive amounts of chloral hydrate, knockout drops, and the whole thing backfired. This story became so big. In my research, I found headlines in Tokyo about George Ratterman.
It actually was really the death knell of the syndicate's operations.
What happens then is Bobby Kennedy is the new Attorney General of the U.S., and he's widely criticized because he was appointed by his brother, Jack Kennedy. And he really had no experience that people would usually associate with that kind of appointment. And he's trying to make a name for himself. And he sees this story about Ratterman. What do you do with your friends? And he says, here's our opportunity. We're going after the mob.
John F. Kennedy visited when he was candidate for president. He visited Newport. And later when he became president, he sent his brother, Bobby Kennedy, who was the Attorney General, to investigate the things that were going on in Newport.
Newport, Kentucky. That's where the vendetta between the mob and the Kennedys begins.
I think a lot of it actually had to do with the fact that John Kennedy came to Newport a couple of times. He met with local leaders. It was hard not to know what was actually still going on at the time.
Bobby Kennedy sends his chief assistant, Ron Goldfarb, to Cincinnati with kind of a blank check. His portfolio is to go there and take care of this problem, and he's going to prosecute these mobsters for civil rights violations of George Ratterman's civil rights. So they finally win, and it was thanks to the testimony of April Flowers, who testified to sitting in the office with Charles Lester and Tito Carenzi while they planned how to frame up George Ratterman and ruin him. One of the fun things about writing books like this is that you get to meet so many people who come forward that you never knew that you would have wished you could have quoted in the book. One of these was an FBI agent who was the agent in charge in Newport. And he told me that years after this all came down and the mobsters were thrown in jail, he heard from an FBI agent in Miami, called him up and just said two words. He said, George Ratterman. And the guy goes, yeah, George Ratterman, April Flowers. And the guy goes, Juanita Hodges, we just found her. And he said, what happened? And he goes, she was decapitated and left in a ditch in Miami. So the mob got its revenge.
Back in Newport, Ratterman had began his term as Campbell County Sheriff, and the reform movement continued to strengthen. The dark and shady curtain over mob activity was beginning to be lifted.
So the big mob moved out, and a lot of lower-level rough people took over, and the chief among those was Screw Andrews. He ran a numbers racket in the west side of Cincinnati, and it was all headquartered at his club called the Sportsman's Club in Newport.
He owned the Yorkshire Club on York Street. Upstairs was a high rollers room that's still there that had glass they could look down onto the casino floor. They also did off-track betting.
Ratterman takes over, and he has this long-running battle with Screw. Eventually, Screw goes to jail, and in his old age, he begins to have signs of dementia. And this is not a good idea as far as the mob's concerned, because he might say anything. He might implicate people. He might expose things. So the story at the hospital where he was being treated is that these guys came in as suits, big guys, and they told everybody to take a break. And what we do know is that a few minutes later, Screw went flying out of the third or fourth story window to his death. And so Screw met a mobster's appropriate end.
The mob started to realize that this was getting too hot of a situation for them. So they pretty much picked up their operations and moved out to Las Vegas. We actually have clubs that moved. The Flamingo Club that used to be on York Street in Newport moved out to Las Vegas with the mob. And the Flamingo Club is still operating in Las Vegas, but it had its roots here in Newport.
The Beverly Hills Country Club was considered the showplace of the nation. But when the mob left town and the city cracked down on gambling, it shut its doors in 1961. Years later, in the 70s, the Beverly Hills Supper Club officially reopened, and the place was booming yet again, with the best entertainment and fine dining. But all that came to a halt on May 28, 1977, when the deadliest fire in Kentucky history rocked the Beverly Hills Supper Club.
Dick Schilling, who was an entrepreneur and a restaurateur, finds the Beverly Hills Country Club is mothballed and shuttered with all of this fantastic, like a time capsule from 1960. He buys it. He says even just the name was worth $1 million. And he goes to work remodeling this club. During his remodeling, the second fire takes place. And the place is nearly burned again, nearly as it's finished. And they find cans of gasoline sitting in the main areas where the fire was started, and nobody had any idea what happened there, but the local fire marshal said it was almost certainly arson. Dick Schilling goes ahead and finishes the place and builds this fantastic, luxurious place called the Beverly Hills Supper Club. And then he begins to restore its fame and glory by bringing in all these acts again that have made the place so famous.
The night of the fire there, the unfortunate fire there, John Davidson was the major entertainer there.
The place is absolutely packed, which that is on Dick Schilling. He had no respect for fire codes. People had no place to go. When the place went up in flames, so many were trapped in the cabaret room. In those days, the materials he used for fabric over chairs, for paneling, They had these horrible byproducts of combustion that caused this terrible toxic gas, so that as that flooded into the cabaret room, even ahead of the flames, a lot of people were overcome by that and killed instantly. Others walked out looking just fine and then dropped dead a minute later.
So many stories are told of that fire and the 165 people who lost their lives. That fire led to a lot of changes in our fire codes. I remember it in particular because I was at a prom that evening, and we came home from the prom and we watched it on television, and it was, to someone in high school, it was just unfathomable that a tragedy of this sort would occur and that so many people's lives were lost.
The Beverly Hills Supper Club fire was of particular interest to Bronson and became a focal point in his book. There are many conflicting stories about what actually happened that Memorial Day night. Some said the fire was caused by faulty aluminum wiring. Some said it was arson.
As I investigated, I found a lot of evidence of a cover-up and massive evidence that showed that it was not aluminum wiring, that it was in fact arson. For example, on the cover-up side, I spoke to an assistant fire marshal who was there at the scene, and they lobbied the governor. They told him this was a crime scene and that needed to be investigated. He basically told them to shut the bleep up. The state police are going to investigate. Now, why would you have the state police investigate a possible arson? So right there, a red flag goes up. The governor shows up while the flames are still not out and declares immediately that was an accident. Who would possibly do that?
It's all very chilling, and I think that kind of forever changed the outlook of ever kind of rebuilding a supper club like that.
Nykirk began working at the Cincinnati Post in 1979 and saw firsthand what was left of the Sin City heyday.
By the time I got here, it was, I'd say, a very seedy version of itself. What still existed in 1979 and into the 1980s was a lot of strip clubs, and Cinema X showed X-rated movies all up and down Monmouth Street. Monmouth Street was sort of the center of what was left of the old Sin City.
There had to be kind of a second cleanup in the 70s and the early 80s.
I remember one night, probably a Saturday night, the state police told us, going to be a big raid on the Cinema X in Newport. So we went out there and parked on the street to wait. Sure enough, right at the appointed time, the police came zooming in on Monmouth Street, and they blocked off the exit to the Cinema X and identified everybody who was coming out of it. They didn't arrest everybody. In fact, I don't think they arrested too many people. They just sort of embarrassed them. That tug of war between the old Newport and the new Newport played out constantly through the 1980s. People 40 or 50 years ago said, we want the city to change. They wrote a plan to change it, and they stuck to it in an impressive way. We have to get more residents to town. We have to fix our housing. We have to get new businesses. We need to develop the riverfront. These were all things that you could have seen if you walked in the planning rooms in Newport in the 1980s, because they had a vision for what the city could be.
Newport on the Levee coming in 20 years ago, the Newport Aquarium, the building that we see in Ovation, the difference in industry that we have now versus 20th century industry. All of these things contribute to this vibrant feel.
While the Sin City era is now nearly 100 years old, people continue to be intrigued by the glamour and danger of Newport's heyday.
There's hardly any romanticized as much as organized crime and the mob. And I think a lot of it is because we know that this existed and that it was all around us. It permeated our society. It corrupted our institutions.
We're just appalled, and also at the same time as appalled, just extremely interested. Our brains are wired to be curious.
Clark said the city continues to focus on marrying historic preservation with new developments, and they are not afraid to tell the whole story when it comes to Newport's past. Reporting from the old Sin City for the Northerner, I'm Emily Sisk.